Welcome to the fourth edition of the Rugby History Project. This week is slightly different. Due to the incredible length of today's episode, I decided to make it free for all. So if you are just a regular free subscriber, you can listen to today's episode as well, and paid subscribers can obviously listen, as that is the main membership benefit for my paid subscriptions. I wanted to play for Wales with my whole heart. An exploration of the players lost to Welsh rugby due to racism. For over a century, working class rugby players left Wales in order to be paid. However, for many men, going north was a necessity as their skin colour was a barrier to rugby in Wales. In June 2025, Billy Boston was honoured with a knighthood, becoming the first rugby league player to receive the nod. In the same month, a book on Roy Francis, written by the legendary Tony Collins, was released. Whilst I was aware of Roy Francis and his incredible career, thanks to a Squidge Rugby video released in 2020, as well as being vaguely aware of the legacy of Welsh Rugby Union players who broke the code and travelled to the north of England to play rugby league, I was not aware of the volume of players who broke the code. After Harry Bowen left Llanelli in 1888 to play for Dewsbury, thousands of working class Welshmen left rugby union to be remunerated for their time. However, there was an undercurrent of racism and xenophobic discrimination within Welsh Rugby Union, which was sometimes an even bigger motivating factor in the decision to go north. I would have loved to have played for Cardiff, and I dreamt of playing for Wales. It was never going to happen. A black man was never going to play for Wales in those days. You can't let it eat at you. You do the next best thing and go north. Terry Michael, 2025. In 1895, representatives from 22 rugby clubs based in the north of England met at the George Hotel in Huddersfield, creating the Northern Rugby Football Union. This new union allowed broken time payments, compensation for time missed from work. The Rugby Football Union deemed broken time payments to be a form of professionalism and banned them in 1886. Upon the formation of the NRFU in 1895, all clubs and players associated with the NRFU were banned from RFU competitions. This schism would go on to be the foundation of the sports of rugby union and rugby league, as well as solidifying the class associations with each of the two sports. Despite Wales having more in common economically with the north of England than the RFU's heartland of southern England, the WRU followed the RFU's lead when it came to professionalisation. Rugby in Wales crossed class boundaries, but amateurism left working class men at a disadvantage, and many were unable to support their families due to the amount of work missed and resulting docked wages. It is likely that the number of Welshmen who travelled north over the course of a century to receive broken time payments is well into the thousands. However, for some who went north, broken time payments were not the only motivating factor. As a port city, Cardiff has long been an ethnically diverse place. With a large black community, the city also has long-standing Italian and Irish communities. Cardiff is not the only place in Wales with a long history of immigration, with Newport having large black, Chinese and Greek communities, and mining communities were also a major attraction for immigrants during the 18th and 19th centuries. Despite this, rugby union has not always represented the whole of Wales. It was an open secret in Welsh Rugby Union that black men would not be selected to represent their nation, with the first black player to break the informal colour bar being Mark Brown in 1983. On top of this, in the early 1900s, it was not unheard of for the Welsh Rugby Union to change white players' names to make the team appear more Welsh. Cardiff and Wales international William O'Neill had his name recorded by the WRU as Billy Neal between 1904 and 1908 as a way to hide his Irish heritage, something which O'Neill reportedly found deeply offensive. O'Neill would be one of the first to sign for a northern team after professionalisation, where his surname was proudly recorded as O'Neill. Further still, black players had little opportunity to play club rugby, let alone a chance to play international rugby. While smaller clubs such as Cardiff International's Athletic Club, based in Tiger Bay, had sides which represented the Cardiff community, larger clubs such as Cardiff RFC were overwhelmingly white. With this in mind, it became increasingly popular during the 20th century for those players who faced discrimination within Welsh rugby to go north and play rugby league. Rugby historian Tony Collins has argued that the working class origins of rugby league allowed for a more egalitarian culture within the sport in comparison to rugby union. Founded on the basis of equality for all players, the first black player known to sign a professional contract was American Lucius Banks for Hunslet in 1912. He was shortly followed by Jimmy Peters, who signed for Barrow in 1913. Peters has been celebrated by the English rugby union community in recent years, as he was the first black player to represent England. However, he left the sport following a series of issues. After facing non-selection due to his race at both club and international levels, Peters was suspended for allegedly accepting payment. Banks's career would only last a year, and World War I would go on to end Peters, but their legacy would continue into the interwar period. It is not known who was the first black Welshman to play rugby league, but George Bennett was the first black player to represent Wales in the sport, and would prove to be an aspirational story for other black Welsh rugby players. Born in Fordham in Montgomeryshire in 1913, Bennett signed for Wigan at the age of just 17. Bennett specifically cited racism in Welsh Rugby Union as a significant contributing factor in his decision. Bennett would go on to play 383 games across 2 clubs during his career. He would also feature in Wales's first ever Rugby League international in 1935, in the process becoming the first black player to represent any British international side in Rugby League. However, despite the acceptance of his race within his club settings and within Welsh Rugby League, Bennett was a noted exception in the 1936 Great Britain Tour of Australia. The official reason given for his omission was to avoid risk of criticism due to Australia's strict colour bar, and unfortunately he would not be the only black Welsh player to be omitted from a Great Britain side due to his race. He stood tall, proud and stoic throughout all life's challenges. He went on to be a leader of men, white men, during a time when most of wider society would not tolerate his existence. Martin Offier, 2025. Roy Francis is one of the most iconic names in rugby league history. Despite this, he's not particularly well known nor recognised within Welsh sporting history. A legendary player who represented Wales, England and Great Britain, he would go on to revolutionise league coaching during a period when coaches weren't even considered essential. All of his achievements would be remarkable and noteworthy if he had been born and bred a rugby league player from the north of England. But he was actually an illegitimate mixed-race Welshman for Bryn Mawr who left Welsh Rugby Union behind to escape institutional racism. Roy Francis's life is one of the most interesting yet heartbreaking tales in rugby. Born to a teenage white mother and a middle-aged black father in a maternity hospital for illegitimate children in Tiger Bay in January 1919, he was adopted as a young child by his father's estranged wife, Rebecca Francis, and raised in Bryn Mawr. Bryn Mawr had a vibrant black community at the time, including at the local rugby club. Making his debut for his village's senior side shortly after his 17th birthday, Francis was approached by a scout from Wigan after his 3rd game. League scouts were not unusual in South Wales at the time, and those who were either excluded from international representation or those looking for financial stability were easy targets. The unemployment rate for black men in Cardiff during the mid-1930s was estimated at the time to sit around 80%. For black rugby union players in South Wales, the opportunity to be remunerated for their time, possibly secure a job through club connections, and have the chance to represent their nation on an international stage made the choice clear. After playing in an amateur game for Wigan A under the name AN Other, Francis signed for Wigan for £400 in November 1936. Wigan was an overwhelmingly white town, with the only recorded people of colour living there at the time being Francis's teammates George Bennett and Len Mason. Francis's time in Wigan was challenging. Whilst he met and married his wife Renee in 1938, he struggled with the secretary-manager Harry Sunderland, who joined the club in October of that year. Sunderland was from Australia, a country with a strict colour bar. The White Australia policy blocked non-European immigration to the country, whilst Indigenous Australians faced severe discrimination at all levels. Sunderland's views were extreme even for an average white Australian, and it is not surprising that Francis's playing time suffered under him. Francis would only play 3 first-team matches under Sunderland's watch, being relegated to Wigan's A team despite being a fan favourite due to his try-scoring rate. The relationship between the two deeply affected Francis, who reflected on his experience by saying, "Racism is like a pain, it's a very, very personal thing." Roy was transferred to Barrow for £450 in January 1939, after being told by Sunderland, "I can't be doing with you." We likely lost out on the prime of Francis's playing career due to World War II. He enlisted on the 16th of October 1939 and spent the entirety of war service in England. This was probably because he had been promoted to sergeant very quickly, and it would have been seen by those higher up as giving the wrong impression for those overseas to see a black man in a position of power. Whilst serving, he underwent physical education training, something which would become incredibly useful later in his career. The rules around amateurism and professionalism were abandoned for servicemen in Britain during the war, and many rugby players played both codes of rugby. Francis himself played club rugby league before being called up to play inter-services rugby union for England. Despite the fact that Francis was not English and that he'd been called up to play Inter-Services Rugby League for Wales at the same time, due to hierarchies he was required to answer the England call-up. Before his second match, Francis faced one of his most infamous and public displays of discrimination, as he was refused entry to the Welford Road changing rooms by security for over an hour, with the men not believing that a black man would be playing for England. It's also interesting to note that whilst other rugby league players were called up to play union for the Welsh representative side during the war, Francis was never considered by Welsh selectors. In 1936, upon the conclusion of the war, and 10 years after George Bennett's exclusion from a British touring side, Francis was excluded from the 1946 Great Britain Rugby League side, which was due to tour Australia. Whilst Francis's form had dipped in 1945 following an injury, he was still regarded as one of the best players in England. A year later, Francis would debut for Great Britain, the first black player to do so, scoring 2 tries in the process and producing the only known footage of Francis during his playing days. However, it would be on home soil, and the footage would be of him celebrating a white player scoring. The remainder of Francis' playing career would be split between Barrow, Warrington and Hull FC, retiring in 1954, having played 346 club games and scoring 225 tries. The last 4 years of Francis' playing career would be spent as a player-coach at Hull FC. From the start of his coaching career, he was innovative, from providing his players with running spikes to pre-season training and film reviews. Whilst this may sound like incredibly simple and basic coaching practices in 2025, in the 1950s it was not unusual for teams to not even have a full-time coach, with club directors making team sheet decisions and captains leading coaching sessions. Whilst Francis had been the unofficial coach from the 1950 season, he signed an official player-coach contract in 1951 and retained his coaching position upon his retirement in 1954. By signing his coaching contract, he became Britain's first ever black professional sports coach. In Britain, Francis would become one of the most successful rugby league coaches of all time, winning the championship twice with Hull and once with Leeds. He would also win the Challenge Cup with Leeds in 1968. He was also successful in providing a healthy environment for his players, encouraging a family atmosphere and acting as a father figure to many players. The mutual respect he had with players and his even-keel attitude was reflective of how Francis wished to be treated by others, with Collins noting that the withholding of dignity and respect is at the dehumanising core of racism. It cannot be overstated how beloved Francis was by his players, with the majority of the opposition to his coaching revolving around his need for complete control of his teams. This control was not only a coaching method. Francis's carefully controlled environment also protected him from racism. Unbeknownst to many of those around him, Francis suffered from mental health issues, which resulted in a 3-week hospital stay in 1961. Whilst many former players have often quipped that they didn't see Francis's race, this is dismissive of his experiences and also perpetuates negative stereotypes of black men. Roy Francis was a successful black man in a position of power in the 1950s and 60s, a black man who was the leader of white men. This was not done without struggle or prejudice. No black man can ever hope to be entirely liberated from this eternal warfare. James Baldwin. Whilst Francis maintained a well-controlled environment in Britain and rarely faced overt racism from the press or management, his short stint coaching North Sydney laid bare the true attitudes of many at the time. During an initial 6-week stint as an associate in 1968, he was extremely successful with an almost permanently struggling team. Management had been initially unaware that Francis was black when they'd hired him, and whilst chairman Harry McKinnon didn't take issue, the team's head coach was former Springbok Cole Greenwood, a noted supporter of his home nation's apartheid regime. Initial media reports were positive, but after Francis became head coach in 1969, the media coverage developed a racist edge. Described as a witch doctor casting spells and compared to Malcolm X, Francis was hounded by the press to a degree he had not faced in Britain. He also faced so-called casual racism from the public, resulting in him becoming reclusive. His wife Renee became incredibly concerned about her husband's well-being, fearing a repeat of his 1961 hospitalisation. And bringing him home, they're crucifying him and he's going to have a nervous breakdown. Renee Francis in a letter to her sons, March 1971. Francis ended up leaving before the start of the 1971 season, a decision which was accepted by North Sydney management and welcomed by the press. When all of your critics are through dealing with you, Mr. Francis, Sydney will be only too willing to forget you. Unfortunate, but true. You are coloured, you see, Mr. Francis, and even if you were the reincarnation of Dally Messenger, You would not have made it in the small world that is Sydney Rugby League. Sydney journalist, 1971. Francis returned to England, but he was never quite the same after his stay in Australia. Aside from winning a championship with Leeds in 1974, his later life was marred by heavy drinking and health issues. Roy passed away on the 5th of April 1989, 12 years after retiring entirely from rugby. Whilst the RFL had hidden behind the White Australia policy in 1936 and 1946, in 1954 selectors were unable to ignore a 19-year-old from Tiger Bay. Billy Boston was born on the 6th of August 1934 to a Sierra Leonean father and a Welsh-Irish mother, and was the middle of 11 children. Raised by the Cardiff Docks, Boston first achieved local fame playing for Cardiff International's Athletic Club, a newly formed diverse club close to his home. After representing Wales in various youth sides, Boston should have been a hot commodity, and despite being born and bred in Cardiff, Boston was not considered by Cardiff RFC. The legendary club had previously passed on black players Johnny Freeman and Colin Dixon. He did, however, catch the eyes of Neath in 1950. In a cruel twist of fate, the journey to Neath required Boston to catch a bus from outside the Arms Park, but he was allegedly slipped £5 after every game from Neath as boot money. Speaking later in life, Boston talked about his snub from Cardiff and had reportedly long accepted that his skin tone probably played a part. I would have loved to play for Cardiff, but it never happened, so that's it. I don't know what it was, but they didn't seem to think I was good enough, so there you are. They made a mistake, not me. Billy Boston, 2018. At the age of 18, Boston was called to complete his national service in Catterick, North Yorkshire. He was quickly picked up to play inter-services rugby union for both his unit and the Army, appearing in the legendary Army v Navy match at Twickenham. Boston also continued to appear for Neath whenever he was on leave, and it was during one of these weekends that scouts caught him at his parents' house. Acting as an unofficial agent, his mother Nellie negotiated for a £3,000 signing-on fee with Wigan chairman Joe Taylor in his front room. Initially offered £1,000 and then £1,500, Mrs. Boston told Taylor that they would consider £3,000. Luckily for Mrs. Boston, Taylor had withdrawn £3,000 from the bank. Her son had been unsure of signing the contract, and he later confided in a reporter that he had cried that night, as signing the contract meant he would be banned from ever playing for Cardiff or Wales. Whilst Boston himself thought that his £3,000 signing-on fee was excessive, it would ultimately pay off for Wigan. Boston would go on to not only become a Wigan legend, but also become known as one of the best players to have ever played the game. During his illustrious career, he scored 571 tries in 564 rugby league matches, making him the second highest try scorer in rugby league history. Unlike Francis, who not only had to wait for his Great Britain debut, but also spent a considerable amount of time playing for Wigan's A-team, Boston made an immediate impact with Wigan after playing his first game in November 1953. Boston's fast start with Wigan also caught the eyes of Great Britain selectors, and he travelled to Australia and New Zealand with the invitational side mere months after switching codes. In doing so, he became the first black British player to tour Australia. Despite missing the first test against Australia, Boston would star throughout the tour. Scoring 6 tries in the 5 tests he played, he scored a total of 36 tries in 18 games across the tour, including 4 tries each against Wide Bay, North Queensland, Canterbury, and in the first test against New Zealand. He also scored a whopping 6 tries against Northern New South Wales. Regardless of Boston's success and record-breaking feats in both his club and invitational sides, he still faced discrimination within rugby league. In 1956, Boston was suspended following Wigan's semi-final loss and forced to write a letter of apology to the club board. Boston had played the game both injured and out of position, but the most upsetting thing to the board members was that Boston had been late to report to the changing room before the match. Boston hadn't been late for superfluous reasons. He'd been helping his heavily pregnant wife to her seat. Boston had been blamed for the loss over any other player, and it's not difficult to see why he'd been blamed as a black man in 1950s Britain. It's not difficult to draw the conclusion that the directors needed a scapegoat, and the stereotype of the lazy, undisciplined black man made it easier for them to blame Billy. Tony Collins, 2025. Boston, however, faced overt acts of racism head-on. One well-known example is when he faced racist heckling from a Swinton fan in 1964. Rather than ignore the racist remarks from the fan, which Roy Francis had often done, Boston decided to enter the stands and confront the Swinton fan, who swiftly ran from the area rather than face the athlete he had abused. He had previously also twice refused to travel to South Africa with Great Britain. Touring South Africa would have required Boston to be segregated from his teammates, staying in a different hotel, taking different transport, and eating in different restaurants. He also inevitably would have faced racist abuse from the crowd and by South African players who had been selected to play. Boston retired in 1970, playing one season for Blackpool Borough after 15 years in Wigan. Remembered by many dual-code Welsh players as a legend, much of the recognition of his legendary career has come in the last decade. Despite his prowess with the Great Britain side, Boston never played a full Test match for Wales. In 2016, he was awarded a legacy cap by Wales Rugby League in recognition of the single non-Test match he played. Boston has also been honoured with various statues, including one just a stone's throw from where he grew up in Cardiff. The largest of all the honours awarded to Boston is the knighthood he received in June 2025, following a campaign backed by MP for Wigan and current Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy. With this honour, he became the first rugby league player to be knighted for services to sport. However, in a cruel twist of fate, Boston was diagnosed with vascular dementia in 2016, before the majority of the recognition of his career outside of rugby league circles. All I have achieved in rugby league, I would have given over for just one Welsh rugby union cap. That was my biggest ambition. I always wanted to play for Wales, and I went to Neath because Cardiff didn't want to know me, but I think it's worked out for the best. There was a lot of colour prejudice at the time, and I don't think I would have ever played for Wales in those days. I never wanted to sign for rugby league, but I saw the doors went open here, and there were no signs that I would get anything. I hope there's a lot of people from the docks that make it, and don't have the same obstacles I had to face. Billy Boston speaking to the South Wales Echo. Clive Sullivan's journey to rugby league was significantly different from Francis's and Boston's, but without their contributions, Sullivan's career may not have been possible. Sullivan's background was similar. Like Francis, he was raised by a black single mother, and like Boston, he was raised in Cardiff. However, unlike them, he was not a childhood rugby superstar. Whilst Francis was the first black player to play for Great Britain, and Boston was the first black player to tour with Great Britain, Sullivan would become the first black player to captain a British international side in any match. Sullivan was born in April 1943 in Cardiff to Caribbean parents. His mother was of Antiguan descent, whilst his father was Jamaican. His parents split up when he was young, and his mother raised him first in Splot before moving to Ely. All four of the Sullivan children were renowned for their sprinting prowess from a very young age, and after moving schools, both Clive and his elder brother Brian transitioned to playing rugby union. Clive in particular looked up to local rugby league superstar Billy Boston. A typical younger brother, Sullivan was obsessive in attempting to surpass the skills of his older brother, but he faced severe injury issues as a teenager. A serious thigh sprain, reportedly caused by overuse during a growth spurt, resulted in him being in a cast for 6 months, and barely able to walk for 2 years. Despite having had a promising youth career, complete with Cardiff schoolboys caps, Sullivan gave up playing rugby. At 18, after a short-lived career as a mechanic, Sullivan joined the army and was posted to Catterick, North Yorkshire, to work as a radio operator. Accounts of what happened next are slightly fuzzy, but it seems that Sullivan was picked to play for the regiment's rugby union team by selectors who assumed Sullivan knew how to play on account of him being Welsh. Sullivan was unable to tell the army about his leg injury, as this would have resulted in dismissal, so he decided to play the match. Sullivan ended up impressing on the wing and proved to himself that he could still play the game that he loved, so he carried on playing inter-services matches. Rugby union matches in Yorkshire were regularly attended by rugby league scouts. Sullivan was spotted by these scouts and picked to play in a Bradford Northern A-team match. Unfortunately, this trial was unsuccessful, but a chance encounter at a bus stop after the match would lead to a signed contract and the start of a legacy. Touch judge Jimmy Harker, the Hull FC insider, spotted Sullivan in his fatigues waiting at the bus stop and gave him a lift to the train station. After a quick chat, Harker promised to speak to the board. After a game of cat and mouse, Sullivan debuted for Hull on the 9th of December 1961. His hat-trick led to a panicked scramble as Hull quickly sought to get him officially signed. Luckily for the Hull board, coach Roy Francis took Sullivan to his house to spend the night. He officially signed his contract on the 10th of December. The first 2 years of his career was spent under Francis, and despite missing periods due to his army services and injury sustained in a serious car accident in 1963, Sullivan developed into a great player under Francis's watchful eye. Francis's influence can also be seen in how Sullivan dealt with racist abuse from spectators, as he often brushed off the abuse and used his talents to prove his worth rather than engage in confrontation. Sullivan's widow told his biographer James Odie decades later that Roy took Clive under his wing. I didn't know Clive then, but he stayed with the Francis family. His wife was really good to Clive. Sullivan's career was plagued with injuries, including an incredibly rare thigh condition which causes muscles to calcify and attach themselves to the bone. Despite his frequent missed time, his high strike rate and incredible reputation not only earned him the Hull FC captaincy, but also kept him in contention for international honours. He was selected for Great Britain for 2 games against France in 1967 and grabbed a hat-trick against New Zealand in the 1968 World Cup. With his selection in 1967, he became the first black player to be selected to represent Great Britain since Billy Boston. Sullivan, however, would go one better than his former coach Francis or his childhood hero Boston. He would go on to become the first black athlete to captain a British international sports team. The 1972 Great Britain season would pose serious issues for selectors due to a controversial brawl in the 1970 final and widespread injuries which took out the majority of captaincy options. With 2 warm-up matches played prior to the tournament, Great Britain management selected Sullivan to captain the first match due to his captaincy experience. The team sustained more injuries in that match, so he also captained the second match. By captaining these matches, Sullivan became the first black captain of any British international team in a major sport. The importance of this achievement has only been celebrated recently, but it is even more impressive due to the fact that Welsh Rugby Union didn't even cap a black player until over a decade later. Following the success of his first 2 outings as a captain, Sullivan was not only selected to play in the 1972 World Cup, but also to captain the team. I had hoped I would be selected, but the news still came as a marvellous surprise. I've been quite pleased with my game this season. Clive Sullivan, 1972. The World Cup was held in France and featured only 4 teams. The round robin saw Great Britain go undefeated and they faced Australia in the final. The French supporters, who had expected to reach the final, did not turn up in Lyon, and the game was played in front of only 4,000 people. Great Britain also couldn't afford to fly out their team's families for the event, and neither could the players, which led to a poor atmosphere from the crowd. Despite this, both teams put on incredible performances and nothing could separate the two. Literally. The match ended in a 10-10 draw. However, as Great Britain had won the team's round-robin match 27-21, they were awarded the World Cup. Clive Sullivan lifted the trophy, but those back home in Britain were not watching live, as the BBC decided not to air the final live due to the violence at the 1970 World Cup. The French league officials also decided not to give out medals, perhaps due to sour grapes from failing to reach the final. Back home, there was not much fanfare either. Sullivan received an MBE for his achievement as captain and also appeared on an episode of This Is Your Life, but otherwise he faded into insignificance outside of rugby league circles. Sullivan would go on to spend 2 more unsuccessful seasons at Hull FC, interspersed with Welsh Rugby League caps. Despite being a club legend who was known for his community outreach, his time in Hull was not fruitful, and he only managed to win a singular Yorkshire Cup. Due to backroom issues at Hull FC, Sullivan decided to leave the club in 1974. However, he was an adopted Hull man at heart, and with a growing family, he decided to stay in the city and switch to Hull FC's arch rivals, Hull Kingston Rovers. With Hull KR, Sullivan finally achieved the pinnacle of British Rugby League, winning a Challenge Cup final at Wembley in 1980 at the age of 37. Heading towards the twilight of his career, Sullivan returned to Hull FC as a player-coach in 1981. In his first season back, he managed to pick up a second Challenge Cup final winners' medal after starring in a rematch held in Leeds. The Challenge Cup rematch would turn out to be the last of Sullivan's big games. He did, however, turn out for both Hull and Doncaster over the next 2 years. By doing such, he became the oldest ever player in a top-flight match, and of course the oldest ever try-scorer too. His primary focus, however, was coaching, acting as head coach at Doncaster and an assistant coach at Hull, before retiring from professional sports entirely ahead of the 1984-85 season. Using his connections, he opened a sports bar called Sully's, which of course had an amateur rugby league side affiliated with it. It was whilst playing for this team in April 1985 that he fell awkwardly on his back. The pain, however, did not subside, leading him to see a doctor. 2 weeks after the match, Sullivan was diagnosed with an aggressive form of liver cancer. Despite undertaking chemotherapy and vowing to fight the disease, Sullivan died on the 8th of October 1985, aged just 42. I used to say you'd die without your rugby. It was said as a joke. But I can't put into words how much he loved the game. That was Clive. And he did die without his rugby. Rosalind Sullivan. The legacies of all three of these men varies widely. In Hull, Clive Sullivan Way is the main road into the city. Billy Boston has a large statue outside Wigan's home ground, and Roy Francis has a statue in Bryn Mawr. Sullivan and Boston also feature in a large statue in Cardiff Bay, along with former Wales and Great Britain captain Gus Risman. Francis's name sits on the base of the statue. Francis, Boston and Sullivan were far from the only black Welsh players to go north, but each of the trio achieved groundbreaking firsts as well as having under-recognised careers. All three of these men deserved to achieve their own dream of playing for the Welsh Rugby Union team, but due to the colour of their skin, they were never even in contention. Whilst the statues in Wales and documentaries around the Welsh lost generations finally give the three men an ounce of recognition they deserve, their true legacy lies in those who followed. The most poetic of careers belongs to Anthony Sullivan, the son of Clive. Not only did the younger Sullivan play for Hull KR and St Helens, he also represented both Wales and Great Britain in rugby league. Following the professionalisation of the sport in 1995, he broke the code. With his switch, Anthony achieved something Francis, Boston and Sullivan Sr. had dreamed of doing but were excluded from due to their race. Playing for Cardiff RFC and the Welsh national rugby union team. Francis, Boston and Sullivan were all on the receiving end of institutional racism, as well as racist attacks whilst playing. Despite their talent and success, all three men were judged according to their skin colour first and fought against prejudice. This abuse was a direct reflection of the society in which they lived. Whilst they all had their own experiences and ways of handling it, the prejudice that they faced was a direct affront to the men's dignity and humanity. To paraphrase Tony Collins, whose book on Roy Francis was invaluable in the writing of this article, the sad truth is that respect and dignity cannot be guaranteed to black men in a racist society. I hope you enjoyed the 4th edition of the Rugby History Project. This has been a real rollercoaster to write and it's ended up being longer than my undergraduate dissertation. I'm no rugby league expert, but I felt that these stories needed to be told in the context of Welsh rugby. References, notations, photos, etc. can be found on the main page of this article, and I hope you guys enjoyed. If you enjoyed listening to my dulcet tones, please consider subscribing, becoming a paid subscriber. And if you didn't, then I guess you can just read my post instead. I hope you've enjoyed the 4th edition of the Rugby History Project. This has been a real rollercoaster to write and has ended up being longer than my undergraduate dissertation. I'm no rugby league expert, but I felt these stories needed to be told in the context of Welsh rugby. Photos, references, notations can be found on the main page. I've recently turned non-paid subscriptions, and if you would like to continue listening to my posts rather than reading them, please do sign up for that.